Today we're taking a look at the Fara R1 V2 gaming PC case from Silverstone. I reached out to Silverstone for a few parts to build a Silverstone themed 12th gen RTX based gaming rig. The Fara R1 V2 is a sleek mid-tower chassis with a front mesh panel. It has the option for a real tempered glass side panel, which I have here, as well as a steel panel if you don't like the tempered glass. It's got top and bottom air filters, all at a competitive price. There's the black tempered glass version, which I mentioned that I have here. There's a black version with the solid steel panel, and the same with white, tempered glass and steel side panels. At first glance, the Fara R1 V2 looks like a pretty bang for the buck type case for a solid mid-range gaming PC. Let's take a look at what's included, the specs, the build quality, and we'll finish building this gaming PC. The Fara R1 V2 includes a basic screw kit, which is pretty much all you need in terms of accessories to get rolling with this build. The front panel of the case is a toolless that pops off fairly easily for access to the fans or for radiator support. On the model I have here, the tempered glass side panel has a metal frame that's easily secured and removed with these two thumb screws. Getting inside of the case, we're taking a look at support for up to a 340mm graphics card, up from 332mm on the Fara R1 version 1. Being that the Fara R1 version 2 has a mid-size chassis, we are getting support for MITX all the way up to standard ATX motherboards. As far as the air cooler support goes, we can stuff up to a 161mm tall tower cooler into this case. In terms of water cooling support, we can opt for either a 280mm rad or a 360mm rad mounted in the front of the case, as well as a 280mm or a 240mm rad the top of the case. On the rear of the case, you do have the option for a 120mm rad if you need it, or it could just be an exhaust fan. As always, make sure to measure your radiators and ensure that they're not going to bump into each other, and you want to take into account the fittings and the tubes to make sure that you have enough room. The front rad location will support up to a 59mm rad thickness, and the top mounting location will support up to 38mm of thickness. Out of the box, you're only getting one 120mm case fan, so you want to make sure that the fans on your CPU cooler do produce a decent amount of air pressure, or you could pick up an extra fan or two to help generate that air pressure to better cool your system. In terms of the I/O on the front panel, this case will have two USB 3.0 ports, as well as one USB 2.0 port, and it does have one combined 3.5mm audio port. As always, I would love to see a USB-C port, but for the price, this makes sense that this case does not have it. When it comes to hard drive support, you have the ability to mount two 3.5-inch hard drives, one of which has the mounting holes for 2.5-inch drives, and you'll have another two dedicated 2.5-inch drive mounting locations. They're plates behind the motherboard tray. Lastly, for power supply compatibility, you can fit up to a 200mm long PSU in this case if the hard drive cage is moved to the front position. The rear hard drive cage, when left in the stock position, will shrink that maximum length that you'll be able to support is 171mm. I tested the 12600K with the RTX 3060, an Asus Realbench, AIDA64, and Prime 95 small FFTs. I did run the tests both stock and with an overclock. For the stock benchmark, I used the stock Gigabyte motherboard settings for the 12600K. For the overclock benchmark, 12600K's P cores were overclocked to 5 GHz and the E cores were overclocked to 4 GHz. I locked the voltage at 1.3 volts. The RTX 3060 for the overclock test was maxed out, which resulted in about 190 watts worth of power draw. For the test setup, I did use the Silverstone PF240 ARGB water cooler, and the ambient temperature in the testing space was about 71 degrees Fahrenheit or about 21.6 C. First up, I always like to run the Asus Realbench stress test, as this test stresses both the CPU and the GPU at the same time to reduce a lot of heat within the case. I ran the 12600K and the RTX 3060 setup through two 8-hour tests, both stock and overclocked. For the stock run, the P cores saw an average temperature of 47.8 C, and the E cores saw an average temperature of 45 C, while the GPU core temp averaged about 71 C. With the overclock settings applied, after another 8-hour test, the average P core temperature was 66.6 C, with an average E-core temperature of 57°, while the RTX 3060 overclocked saw an average core temp of 74°. Next up, we have the Asus 64 CPU stress test. I ran both configurations, stock and overclocked, for 2 hours each. For the stock run, the P cores averaged 46.83C, with the E cores averaging 45C. With the CPU overclock applied, the P core average temps raised to about 65C, and the E core average raised to 59C. Lastly, I always try to run Prime 95 to see what the absolute worst case possible temperatures would be. Prime 95 is a relatively unrealistic stress test that puts your CPU under more load than it will probably ever handle or see unless all you plan to do with your computer is run Prime 95. That being said, the stock run for Prime 95 saw an average P-core temperature of 60.6C with an average E-core temperature of 55C. Now getting to the overclock test, with the overclock settings applied, despite having a water cooler installed, the P-cores still hit 98C on average and the E-cores hit 82.3C on average. This is a little bit higher than some of the other cases that I've tested recently, but I do believe that's because this case comes in at a lower dollar value and only includes one fan. As I mentioned, this test is extremely hard and very unrealistic, but it's something to keep in mind that when you purchase the Fara R1 V2, you may wish to purchase 1 or 2 extra case fans, depending on the cooler that you use for the CPU or the GPU. My opinion of building inside this case, overall, is really high. The build quality was very good. I did not have any defects, no rough sharp edges, no shipping damage, and all of the cable management routing all made sense. The front I/O panel connections were good. I liked that there were a couple extra USB ports. As I mentioned, I wish there was a USB-C, but on a case at this price level, I definitely understand why there wasn't. For those of us still using 3.5mm audio headsets, definitely appreciate seeing that port there. I will say that in general, I'm a fan of black cases that have tasteful RGB components installed. I really liked the way that this build looked once it was finished. The only improvements that I would probably make to this case would to be either replace the stock fan with a fan that pushes more air, or simply include 2 fans to help create more pressure inside of the case to help reduce your system temperatures. Generally speaking, my 12600K and the RTX 3060 that I used in this test system performed really well inside of this case during all of the stress tests. There's no question that you'd be able to run stock and with a light overclock. If you're looking to really push the settings though, definitely pick up that second fan. So would I buy this case? Well, if I was looking for a sleek and stylish gaming PC case with excellent build quality and didn't want to spend a ton of money, I would definitely consider the Silverstone Fara R1 V2. In terms of features and pricing, it's pretty competitive, and if you like that front mesh panel design, or you prefer no RGB or to pick your own RGB, for example, the Fara R1 V2 has quite a lot of build potential. If you like this one, hit that like button and let me know down in the comment section what you thought about this case and what features you care about most when you go to purchase a gaming PC case. Is it I/O? Is it cooling performance? Or is it the looks? Or is it simply just the price? Subscribe and hit the bell icon if you want more gaming, home lab, and review content in the future. Thanks for watching.